Good evening and welcome to In-Depth Defense with Jim McAleese. I'm your host, Lauren Longwell, and tonight we have the honor of sitting down with Jim McAleese. Mr. McAleese is a multi-year recipient of the prestigious WASH 100 Award. He's also a respected authority on the Department of Defense budget cycle, the industrial base, as well as defense and acquisition policy. He also produces the sophisticated and sought-after McAleese analysis. And probably the thing closest to his heart, and we all know about Mr. McAleese, is his passion for the warfighter in all he does and says. So, welcome, Mr. McAleese.
Good to be in the house, ma'am.
I'm excited. We get to hang out tonight and go through a lot of key issues. We're going to highlight major themes and some big picture issues.
Okay.
Semiconductors, the China fight, labor shortage. We're going to talk through some of those, plus discuss the impacts of the 2022 contract earnings.
Excellent.
And also what's ahead is that it's in our rear view. And then personally, professionally, I always find compelling insight. And I'm excited to go through the upcoming prioritized programs, technologies, innovations by service in the FY 2024 budgets that are coming out.
Absolutely. So
Sound
this will
good?
be, I'll try to squeeze everything, and this will be, think of this as coffee with Jim. And so I'll try to be as candid and predictive as I possibly can be as the companies and DoD begins to finish the execution of 2022, and then hopefully what we can expect going into 2023 here shortly after the election.
Perfect.
Yes, ma'am.
All right, let's get started.
Yes, ma'am.
All right, with the second quarter 2022 contractor results being in the rearview mirror, what were some of the themes that emerged? And then looking forward to 2023, what do you see as some of the issues that might be on the horizon?
There's probably, candidly speaking, so as a practical matter, you should always expect me to follow the big 8 defense primes that the department follows, right? So this would be, obviously impartially, it would be Lockheed, Boeing, Northrop, Raytheon, GD, BAE Systems. They surface twice a year. They're London Exchange. L3 Harris, and then Huntington Ingalls. And so those are really your big 8. When we ground through the 2Q results, there were 4 or 5 major themes. The first was that the immediate impact of inflation was not as bad as I thought it was going to be.
Okay.
So the current inflation is approximately 8.5%, it's beginning to trend downward. When I looked at the sector operating profits at the operational level, whether it was Lockheed or throughout any of the major companies, it was at approximately 11%, which is in line with where they should be. Very, very strong earnings. So yes, there'll be extra costs of delivering things for fuel, those types of activities, but clearly the majority of the subcontract and the labor was already locked in.
Okay.
And then the question will be, what happens then for next year in terms of the pricing rates, right? But as a practical matter, there was no immediate catastrophic impact from a defense industrial base perspective, number one. Number two, it was different company by company, but it was very, very clear that there was a significant impact from supply chain disruption and also labor shortages across the board. So you would see, for example, I don't want to single out any contractor, but really as a practical matter, the sales would have fallen by about 4%.
Okay.
Right, there's a mixture of supply chain disruption, also labor shortages, and then you would have seen about the sector profit, right, in terms of the operational profit, generally fell by about 10% or slightly more across the board, right? Sometimes it was tied to a specific program, for example, the F-35. Other times it was really tied to late supplier deliveries. You'd find this particularly in, for example, in missile assemblies. And then in some cases it was pure labor shortages. This is particularly something where you saw in shipbuilding, both at General Dynamics Electric Boat, where they had to move workers from the Virginia attack submarine, lower priority, important, but less important than the Columbia SSBN submarine, right, ballistic submarine. And then you saw that same labor shortage impact as well, also down at Huntington Ingalls, Newport News, which is the other half of basically the shipbuilding. So 4% sales drop, about a 10% sector profit drop. The companies are more upbeat in their results calls because they're talking to investors. and so, but then they filed their 10Q SEC filings, right? And so most of the contractors were very prolific in saying, hey, there was a specific impact to this specific sector, late supplier deliveries. There was specific, you would see them in a 10Q, they're referred to as unfavorable EAC estimate at completion adjustments.
Okay.
Unfavorable EAC adjustments, those are charges. And so in many cases, you'd see labor shortages or you'd see late supplier deliveries, and then you would see unfavorable EAC adjustments or charges that fundamentally would be tied to specific sectors of those companies, and then you could easily deduce what programs were impacted from there. Let's see, what else was important? As I don't want to be doom and gloom because that's not indeed the case at all. When I looked across all of the companies are healthy, right, and they're going to remain healthy. The majority of the companies, some of them reduced their sales guidance for 2022 a little bit.
Okay.
Right, 1 to 3%, depending upon the company. But religiously, almost all the companies maintained their 2022 guidance for the earnings per share or for their free cash flow. And remember, as you know, so cash flow, the sales, sector profit, right? Cash flow fundamentally minus the CapEx investment that I put back into my business in terms of facilities, that generates the free cash flow. And that free cash flow fundamentally drives both dividend increases and it also drives share repurchases, which increases the value of the stock by reducing the shares.
Okay.
And so as a practical matter, there was a very strong reluctance to in any way reduce the free cash flow, right? And that's for another two reasons. Forgive me for being so crude. First of all, the defense contractors currently find themselves in a situation where there's a tremendous demand signal for deterrence and national security in the wake of Ukraine.
Right.
Right. Russia is now an acute threat, and China is now the pacing threat. And they're incredibly unpredictable at this time. So the defense stocks find themselves, as a general family, they find themselves at least 10 to 20% stock price increase from the beginning of the year. And yet at the same time, the rest of the S&P 500 finds itself, because of the interest rate increases and fears of the U.S. recession, the S&P top 500 dropped by 20%. So the major defense primes went here, and the S&P is slowly but surely clawing its way back to about 10%. So as a practical matter, most of the CEOs, he or she, find themselves in a situation where for the year to date, their firms are valued at anywhere between at least 20 to 30% above where the S&P 500 is today. And so during these results calls, the CEOs are very reluctant. When the investor is afraid of where to put their money, the safest place to put it is in a defense stock at a time of war. And so the CEO will be highly reluctant during a results call to excessively speculate about potential things that could be happening with the company. So step number one. Step number two, obviously the contractors are healthy, but they are returning about 103% of that free cash flow for 2022. So they've put out guidance for 2022.
Yep.
The eight major primes, right? And Boeing's a little bit of an exception because they're negative free cash flow now, but they should return to cash flow positive by the end of the year. And that appears to be occurring. And when you look at the major eight primes, they should generate, their guidance to the investors is they will generate approximately $22.3 billion of free cash flow in 2022. Wow. They have committed, in terms of their 2022 guidance to the owners of the companies, the investors, they've committed to return about $23 billion to the investors in 2022. And that's generally a mixture of about $11 billion of dividends.
Okay. Right,
which a contractor likes to increase by 7, 8, 9, 10% per year. And then additionally share repurchases, about $12 billion of share repurchases, right? And so that as a practical matter, the contractors are healthy. There's no visible indication of damage, right? The third trend I think is important is we're not yet seeing the extra funding that Congress provided to the department in 2022. That has not appeared.
Okay.
And so what you're seeing is, in all the results calls, the investors are going, where's the growth, where's the growth? Thinking there's going to be an immediate transition from the extra 2022 funding. Remember, Congress gave the department extra 5% of $742 billion in 2022,
Yep.
right, over the $704 billion in 2021. That's about $39 billion more, right? And about $17 billion of that at least goes into the DoD investment accounts, RDT&E, and also procurement. And so fundamentally what you're seeing as of 2Q, right, we're only at the beginning of seeing that extra 5%, that extra $39 billion of higher 2022 defense funding is just now being put under contract. So as a practical matter, the companies are going to be very reluctant to really be able to say, hey, it's going to have a significant impact on 2022 sales, and therefore on 2022 sector profit, and therefore on 2022 free cash flow. So most of the CEOs, whether it's the DoD funding or the extra Ukraine supplementals or the demand signal from the NATO members to increase their security, most of the CEOs are really projecting to about mid-2023, if not 2024, before this significant spike in sales and sector profit and cash flow drives through their companies.
Okay.
So have I covered, is there anything I missed that was important?
No, you did a wonderful job recapping what we saw in the rear view, but then also what you see coming up. So I really appreciate that with the roadmap ahead.
And one thing that might be important to just, there's a huge difference between a labor shortage versus late supplier deliveries. And so as a practical matter, many people are accidentally mistaking them as inflation. They're not, right? And so the labor shortage, as a practical matter, there was only one CEO who spoke truth to power. That was Greg Hayes from Raytheon, and he basically, during his results call, he basically said, hey, there's a significant possibility that paying the workforce for 2 years to stay home resulted in a significant shrinking of the workforce, right. And therefore there's going to be a much smaller workforce that you have to fight to recruit to come back and work in industrial operations. To be fair, to their credit, almost all the CEOs had anticipated that as soon as COVID was complete, the workforce would bounce back, employee absenteeism, so on and so forth, teleworking, and then during Omicron, the thought was, okay, the workforce is going to bounce back. It was only really during the tail end of 2Q, as particularly the commercial aerospace companies were recalling workers that had been furloughed, right, where suddenly the workforce was not returning, and it suddenly became apparent to the industry that the actual workforce is now significantly smaller. Okay. And then on the labor shortages are generally, they're not labor shortages across the board, but they are largely geographically driven. Places, for example, out in Palmdale, California, where the Air Force has a lot of their classified programs and major production out there. Northeastern shipyards, shipbuilding, where you really have to grow the trades, sure. Right? And for the most part, most of the contractors were very good about identifying where the sales and the profit had fallen short because of late supplier deliveries, because you couldn't build DoD until you've been billed, sure. And the product's been delivered, versus the labor shortages. The $64 million question is going to be, all the CEOs basically said, hey, with the exception of one, all the CEOs basically said, hey, this is a 2Q impact, and there should be a significant bounce back in 3Q and 4Q, right? Only one or two of the contractors really said, hey, they're going to reduce the sales guidance for the year, which is a clear indication that the supply chain problems and labor shortages are going to cascade into 2023. Okay. So the thing we'll really be looking for in 2023 will be, are the trend lines, are they getting worse? Right. Are they flattening? Are they stabilizing?
Got to look at that slope.
Yes, and to interestingly enough, one of the innovative things that did come up in one of the results calls, and I apologize for playing favorites, but it is something that they're doing. The Northrop CEO, Kathy Warden, did announce that in their case, because of the inherent difficulty of finding a workforce to stand up for new programs, right, out in California, they were actually creating training centers. And so my assessment would be, I think what they're doing is they're recruiting the workforce, right, bringing them in, lower level workers, training them to a higher level while they also get their clearance, and then putting them on the higher level production programs. In this case, presumably it would be the F-35 center fuselage, right, which is clearly behind, and then secondarily would be the preparations to ramp up production of the Air Force B-21 penetrating bomber, which is going into low rate initial production in 2023.
You did an amazing job answering that. You did such a great job. You answered not only the first question, but the second question.
Excellent.
So we're moving right along. Now as we move forward, we're going to talk about the accelerating threats such as China.
Right.
And as we see this China fight moving, potentially closer,
yes, ma'am,
and sooner, what do you see? How do you see that impacting the weapons and what we'll be building for defense?
Yes, ma'am. We know several things. We know that President Xi from China has instructed the PLA to prepare for what they refer to as intelligentized warfare, which is our equivalent of the joint force. Intelligentized warfare by approximately 2027.
Okay.
So initially that was 2035. Now it got a little closer, which was 2030.
Right.
And now we think he's directed his forces to be prepared for intelligentized warfare by 2027. The most obvious issue would be perhaps Taiwan, right? And so the entire Ukraine awakening, right, with this how unpredictable Russia could be, right, is now only galvanized the American people into what a much more significant confrontation would be with China. Not only is China a military and technology competitor, they're an ideological competitor in terms of global dominance, and their economy is fundamentally almost the size of that of the United States. And so the ability to deter China simply through sanctions is not likely to be achievable in that sense. When you look into all the services, the good news, for the last 2 years, all of the services are heading well on their way.
Okay.
Each from my outside perspective looking in, right, and going through the budgets, probably the most distinctive is probably the Air Force right off the bat. And so when you look at the Air Force budget, the majority of the Blue Air Force budget, right, with the 40 billion-ish of the classified pass-through scraped off, the Blue Air Force budget and the Space Force budget for the new U.S. Space Force, they're two standalone budgets now. The majority of the Blue Air Force is spent on one of two fights, either Air Force Global Strike Command, which is General Tony Cotton, as you know, and that is 2023 B-21 low-rate initial production. That's accelerating the development of the ground-based strategic deterrent, the replacement for the Minuteman III ICBM. As you know, the Air Force has named that the Sentinel. This is the re-engining and the avionics upgrades to the B-52, right? And then the armament of choice for the B-52 from a nuclear perspective would be the long-range standoff weapon, right? And then last but not least, you also have the NC-3, the nuclear command and control, which the Air Force also has responsibility for. And so there's a very large slug of development money and the beginning of procurement money, right, going into the Air Force Global Strike Command to deter both the now two peers, not just of Russia, but also a China that appears to be in a strategic breakout in terms of building its own triad, and appears to be on path to want to achieve something of similar parity to the U.S. by approximately 2030-ish. So that's the first half of the Air Force budget, very clearly defined, and a very clear schedule from 2023, right, which will be coming up until 2027, which is the current 5-year, the FIDEP, Future Defense Plan. And then the second one is really for Air Combat Command, and that's the China fight. And so that'll be a mixture of the next, obviously, NGAD, which is Next Generation Air Dominance,
Yep.
which will be the eventual replacement for the F-22, presumably early 2030s, in terms of an air superiority fight to be able to operate closer to the shore of China. Number two, of course, the F-35, which is really the quarterback, the ability to operate within a close space to the China shoreline, and also be able to call for backup fires from missile trucks, even if it doesn't engage the enemy. And then you've obviously seen the Air Force has moved forward with the E-7.
Yes.
This is the replacement for the AWACS. So the airborne moving target indicator, the ability to control the air superiority fight. And then last but not least is the focus on longer range fires. The one thing that is interesting from an Air Force perspective, Secretary Kendall talks about the 7 operational
Yep.
imperatives. And so you already know them. So they run from the space order battle, so we don't lose control of space. And so the Chinese are not allowed to use space to target US forces as well. To the advanced battle management system, which is really the ability to begin building networks around, for example, the KC-46 tanker, and then moving forward from there to the next generation of dominance. Obviously, the community is very excited about the concept of the family of systems, so that they're not just the next generation air dominance, very, very expensive manned fighter, but the collaborative combat aircraft, or the CCA. And so some number of strike UAVs that would then be teamed to the manned aircraft, whether they be sensors, whether they be decoys, whether they be strike missiles themselves, whether they be carriers of strike missiles.
Right.
Right. And so what you really see is the Air Force, a pattern is emerging, and certainly the Air Force leadership very respectful, right, in terms of how they characterize it. But when I look at their budget, what I see is not just the strengthening of the nuclear triad in terms of being able to deter China and Russia from being able to coerce the United States, but also the ability to, if directed by a future administration, to actually be able to direct massed fires of significant volume and deep range, deep into China. And so, which is something from a President Xi's perspective. There's probably two things that would, I don't know him personally, forgive me.
Right.
But there's probably two things that would bother a decision maker of that magnitude, who clearly has expressed an intent to displace the U.S. militarily and also to displace the U.S. economically.
Understood.
One of those is the ability to lose control of one's country from mass waves of fire deep into the country when the CCP is only a small minority of the 1.4 billion Chinese to begin with. The other of those is probably a blockade, or perhaps a mixture of both at the same time.
Right.
Right. And so clearly I can see that the Air Force has the largest modernization accounts, and I can clearly see they're putting them to good use in both of those two missions. The Navy is a slightly different mission. So as you know, General Berger,
Yes.
Marine Corps Commandant, he has about $50 billion a year. He is making great progress with the Force Design 2030, right? There are obviously there are some concerns occasionally that come up, but it looks like Congress is highly supportive. And the one thing that I can clearly see General Berger has consistently hammered away on is that it is not his intention to make the Marine littoral regiments the stand-in forces, right? If I could characterize what I think he's trying to do, his position is I have to be right there to stop you. Because if I'm not right there to stop you, you're just going to keep progressing and moving and moving and moving. Step number one. Step number two is he has reinforced it. It's really a matter of the ability to hide and the ability to get the first rounds off accurately, and that there is no intention from his perspective to reduce the amount of lethality that the Marines are going to bring to the fight. And so he's moving in a direction of being able to actually bring sea control, long-range fires, and also be able to defend those Marine littoral regiments. Admiral Gilday, the Chief of Naval Operations, he's taking a slightly different approach. He has a bigger mission set that he has to work with. And so what you can see fundamentally within his budget is within that $183 billion-ish, that his money is beginning to flowing to the shipbuilding. And as a practical matter, people are really concerned about, hey, we're not building enough ships. Admiral Gilday has been clear. The optimal solution to address the China problem will be a dispersed fleet. It needs to be approximately 355 ships that are manned, and over time, approximately 150 unmanned ships. He's been clear that it's a resourcing challenge as well. And he, like the Air Force, he basically has to find lower priority things inside his budget to not do to be able to fund two things. One is the increase in the industrial capacity to then move to 2 orders and 3 orders of each ship classes per year.
Yep.
Right. At the same time, he also has to recapitalize the Ohio class submarine. So this is the current 14 Ohio class submarines. They will soon reach their 42-year life. And so the Navy is, I believe, looking at about 5 of those to get a little bit more, maybe another 3 years each out of those extra 5 of the 14. But by 2026, the Admiral Gilday has to be in serial production of one $8 billion Columbia submarine per year, all the way from 2026 all the way through 2035. So when you look inside his budget, each year when I outside looking in, the trade space is getting tougher and tougher and tougher and tougher, right? In other words, so that's where he's coming from. The Army, obviously, Secretary Wormuth, General McCombo, and they are working hard to get into the China fight, right? There's been a tremendous appreciation of the Army now that we've really seen what the Army would have to be doing in a EUCOM fight with China. I'm sorry, with China, forgive me. I just named President Putin to be China. There's now, I think, a very, very clear understanding among the American people why we have an army.
Yes.
And what that U.S. Army would be doing in EUCOM, in Europe, if Putin were to move beyond Ukraine and attempt to further transgress into actual NATO. The President has been clear that the United States will protect every inch of NATO. Equally importantly, when I look at the Army's budget, the Army has the smallest of the budgets, versus the Blue Air Force, Space Force versus the Navy, Marine Corps. The Army's about 177 billion. I often refer to them as the Wolverines. They're very scrappy. They have to fight for table scraps. And so what they're fundamentally doing is they're slightly reducing their end strength. Right, the COVID impact has impacted the Army recruiting just as it has impacted everything else. Sure. So they're going to bring that end strength down in the active Army, right, down by about 12,000 soldiers. And then they're continuing to fully fund all of the readiness activities to make sure that they are ready to fight tonight if necessary. Within their modernization portfolio, they've been very consistent. This is a very important industry. They've been very consistent. There are 6 priorities, right? And when the chief talks, you'll generally hear him refer to, at least what I hear him talk about when he speaks publicly, is the concept of 24 by 2023. Within those 6 priorities, whether it's future vertical lift or whether it's the network or M-SHORAD, there's 24 prototypes that by the end of 2023, he and the Secretary Wormuth, is desperately trying to get to the point where they're either in production or they're at the final phase of the development, right, so that they're ready to then go into production. Things that would be immediately relevant in terms of the Army for a China fight. The first would be the long-range hypersonic weapon. Clearly, that's something that probably President Xi would be aware of. And islands are unsinkable, and so the long-range hypersonic weapon would be the first one. The Army should field the first battery by the end of 2023, and then there'll be additional batteries currently planned in basically 2-year increments, so 2025 and then 2027. The second one would be clearly the future vertical lift, right? And so the Army is expected to make a downslick decision on the future long-range. It's alphabet soup, obviously, as you know. It's a FLURA,
yes,
right? The famous French word, which is actually an aircraft. Future long-range assault aircraft, that decision should be coming out probably about October.
Okay.
Right, and that's basically a Lockheed Boeing team versus a Textron team. And what the Army has articulated is that would deliver range and speed. And so don't think flying to a target and then flying back to a base. think perhaps in a China fight something like island hopping,
Understood.
where you're jumping from island to get to where you need to be. Clearly, the third, and let me step back for a moment. After the long-range hypersonic weapon, the Army's been very, very clear that they're focused on killing ships. And so currently the PLA and Navy has about 350 ships. They're generally smaller. They're multi-mission ships, but they're smaller, generally frigate size. They're not in the class of the big DDG-51s that the U.S. has. But they do plan to grow to about 460 ships by 2030. And so beyond the big long-range hypersonic weapon, the Army is preparing what they refer to as the mid-range capability. And so the mid-range capability is actually a hypersonic SM-6, right, as well as a big, heavy, right, high explosive maritime Tomahawk. And so the Army is clearly moving into strategic long-range fires into China, and also being the ability to sink those 460 Chinese ships, right? And then additionally as well, they have the what's called the PRISM, which is the precision strike missile, which also would then, a longer range version of that with a different seeker would then bring you back into additional ability to sink ships. And so the Army's clearly coming to what is often thought of as a Navy, Air Force, Space Force fight, right? And so clearly long-range fires, clearly the future vertical lift, and then the other one, of course, is the network. Okay. The Army's been very outspoken recently about $2 billion-ish per year in terms of the ability to try to take that resourcing and be able to turn that into the Joint All-Domain Command and Control, the JADC2. So each of the services obviously will become part of JADC2 over time to fight together as part of the joint force. And the Army has a huge, literally experiment in the desert at 130 degrees every year. So the next one will be Project Convergence 2022, okay, where the other services will participate as well as allies, right? And then of course the Army also delivers all the logistics, right, for all of the services for that fight, and also the missile defense, right, to be able to protect the U.S. bases from the deep missile magazines that the Chinese bring to bear.
Wow. Well, thank you. That was amazing. And I think you did it again, Mr. McAleese.
Are we done? Are we out of questions?
No, we're not out of questions, but you were awesome telling us how, looking at the budget,
yes, ma'am,
how we are preparing for this accelerated China fight.
Yes,
My
ma'am.
next question was going to be for technology, innovations,
yes,
seeing
ma'am.
the 2024, FY 2024
yes,
budget,
ma'am.
what you see per service anticipated. But
yes,
I think
ma'am.
you gave us a good overview. Is there anything in addition that you would like to put?
So you're jumping from 2022 to 2024.
Yes.
Right? So we're forgetting 2023. So I that's my fault. I should have been clear. In my 900 words a minute, gusts up 1,200 words per minute. The so as you know, Congress was incredibly generous. They provided an extra 5%, $39 billion in 2022.
Yes.
$742 billion. We're now in the middle of the congressional marks. And so the general expectation from my perspective outside looking in is probably a short-term CR till we get through the election.
Yes.
There's a general sense of optimism, right? The administration has asked for a $31 billion increase to $773 billion in 2023. That would be another 4% on top of the 5%, $39 billion increase in 2022. The administration has also asked for approximately about an 11% increase in the domestic priorities, about a $78 billion increase. Yep. And so the two of them together, just over $100 billion. And so there is likely to be, forgive me for being optimistic, but there's likely to be a repeat of what we saw last year, which was a negotiated outcome where the domestic funding increase is roughly proportionate to the DoD funding increase.
Right.
So the House Hack D, Hack Defense had marked first, and they marked flat to the president's budget to protect the domestic funding increases in 2023. The House Armed Services Committee, Chairman Adam Smith. I wish I had his ability to come up with the quips that he comes up with. So every time he speaks, he has a new one, and they're almost all brilliant. And so the HASC had marked to about a $67 billion increase in 2023, both a mixture of programmatic increases plus also pay raises to be able to adapt to inflation. So
yes.
that would be about a 9% increase. That would take you to about an $810 billion 2023, right, defense budget, which would be able to address both the Russia and the China threats. The Senate Armed Services Committee, this is Chairman Jack Reed, and of course the ranking member, Senator Enoff, who's retiring this year. Both of them very passionate. And as you know, they've marked to a 10% increase. So that's a $76 billion. So that's it would go from about $742 billion in 2022 for DoD to about an $818 billion for 2023.
Okay.
And then obviously Senate Appropriations Committee on the Democratic side had issued their proposal, and that's about a $60 billion increase, so about a 7% increase in 2023. And so presumably shortly after the election, we'll see a final compromise in terms of a 1.6 billion, forgive me, $1.6 trillion 2023 omnibus. And so that would provide the domestic funding increases that the administration values, the intercity education, the HHS, the HUD, the EPA, the State Department, and also the Veterans Affairs. And that would then also take care of the DoD funding, primarily targeted at the emerging China threat. And so then the question will be, where does 2024 go? We know generally that the Air Force's 2024, 2028, so will be the next POM cycle, the Program Objective Memorandum, that Secretary Austin and Deputy Secretary Hicks will preside over. Those final decisions should be made sometime between about November, December, January.
Okay.
Right. So we haven't seen any big issues pop out yet. There's any number of them that are in there, but from an outside perspective, looking in, I would generally tend to expect the Air Force would full speed ahead on the 7 operational imperatives, right, to both nuclear recap, but also prepare for the China fight. I would anticipate the Army would be focused on getting those final 24 by 2023 modernization priorities, and they have made great progress. So they've made next generation squad weapon. They've awarded the mobile protected firepower. By then, they will have awarded future long range assault. So they're making great progress. And then last but not least will be the Navy. And so the Navy one will be whether or not the additional funding is provided to be able to allow the Navy to increase the shipbuilding capacity, right? And so the Navy really is stuck between a rock and a hard spot there. So that would be an area that would be worth watching as we get closer.
Okay.
Yes,
Well, I
ma'am.
appreciate. Thank you for walking us through.
Yes,
Keeping
ma'am.
the eyes focused.
Yes, ma'am.
Hey, the next thing we're going to discuss is a pain point. You know, we've discussed the labor, the
Yes, ma'am.
supply chain. Next one's semiconductors.
Okay.
And the recent passage of the CHIPS Act.
Yes, ma'am.
How do you see that impacting the science and technology portfolio portion of all of this?
Yes, ma'am. So I'm a DoD budget wonk. So I'm a little guy looking at a much bigger problem. It's very clear that China has embarked upon a strategy to erode, weaken, and then usurp the United States. And critical to reaching that objective is becoming the world's largest economy and controlling the specific wealth drivers. Right. One of those is obviously semiconductors. It's generally thought, and I can't prove this, but anecdotally, it's generally thought that the Chinese subsidize about 40% ish of the semiconductor production inside China, and then the majority of what they do not control is obviously in Taiwan.
Okay.
Right. When I look at the CHIPS Act, so obviously the president signed it, I think, on August 9th. So it's now law. It's approximately $280 billion, and there's really three buckets. There's about $52 billion that actually goes into semiconductor chip production itself. About 40 billion-ish of the 52 is for actual U.S. Chip manufacturing. There are three that I can easily see that come across. One is Intel, who I think is already building plants in Ohio and I think Arizona, or it's Arizona, I think Ohio. Another one is Samsung, right, who's building plants in the U.S. as well. And the third one would be the Taiwanese Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation, who I think is also committed to building plants here in the U.S. And so those are the three primary, right, in terms of the grants for the actual production of chips. My recollection is there's another 11 billion-ish that's designed for people that aren't actually doing chip manufacturing, but the chip design, packaging, yes. Right? And that's about $11 billion. And that would include people like AMD, right? And then there's approximately about another 200 billion-ish or so over a period of time. And that's where the federal R&D money would come in. Things like National Science Foundation, those types of activities. And so that's the big picture there.
All right.
DoD gets a very small piece of that. But the DoD has been very vocal, right? But particularly Deputy Secretary Hicks about the importance of being able to have that U.S. manufacturer. On an ominous note, the Chinese had, and forgive me for being so blunt, when the Chinese reacted to Speaker Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, I think most of the American people saw that they were telegraphing the ability to blockade Taiwan by having the 6 exercise areas around the island. I also noticed that when they were firing missiles through the Taiwan airspace, in my heart, I think they were trying to telegraph the U.S. that they believe they can bring the global economy to its knees by destroying the Taiwan chip manufacturer. Right, and so the faster, the $280 billion is already committed on behalf of the United States government, but the faster these companies can break ground and within 3 years be able to produce these chips, to be able to remove that ability of President Xi to wake up one day and have a bad hair day, right, and say, I'm not going to go to war against the United States. I'm simply going to destroy 4 factories in Taiwan.
Right.
So that I look at the CHIPS Act not as an ideological matter. I look at the CHIPS Act as being able to remove that option from President Xi.
Well, I appreciate it.
Yes,
Thank you for giving me and all of us these amazing insights, not just on the CHIPS Act, but
yes,
looking at, the consolidated reports, the current budget,
yes,
the future budget. As always, it's very illuminating and compelling, and it helps us do our work better and help support the warfighter, which
yes,
at the end of the day is, why we do what we do.
Yes, ma'am.
So we appreciate it. We thank you all for joining us today for In-Depth Defense with Jim McAleese.